Just think about it. The year is 2004. The device in your pocket wasn't just a phone, it was a part of your identity. While walking down the street, sitting in a cafe, or in the schoolyard, everyone had those iconic devices with the green logo. The back cover had Sony Ericsson written in capital letters. When that phone was placed on the table, there would be a silent admiration in the room. That aesthetic that made people say, "This kid knows his stuff," was an aura that many brands still haven't been able to achieve even today. So, how did this magnificent empire begin? Many people think of this merger as a strategic move, but in fact it was a marriage of desperation. In March 2000, a lightning strike hit a Philips chip factory in New Mexico. It looked like a small fire that only lasted about 10 minutes. Philips said their engineers would be back in a few days, but they were wrong. The production lines were destroyed. Ericsson had more than 10% of the global mobile market at that time, but all its components came from this factory. Nokia sensed this crisis and immediately sought out other suppliers. But Ericsson was so clumsy that it silently watched itself sink. Billions of dollars in losses, empty shelves, and a shattered reputation. They had changed the world with Walkmans, but mobile phones were like soulless metal boxes. Two wounded giants met in a dark tunnel. One knew the infrastructure, the other knew the spirit. Those signatures signed in 2001 would not only establish a company but also shape the lifestyle of a generation. The first fruits of the partnership were met with skepticism. But when the T610 took the stage, the world fell silent. At that time, phones either looked crude or overly technological. The T610, on the other hand, was a pure work of art, aluminum case, color display. But the real blow came in 2005. Sony placed its nuclear weapon on the table, the Walkman. Do you remember the W800i model? Those orange details. So, the professional headphones that came out of the box and that tiny music button. People no longer wanted to carry an MP3 player with them. Sony Ericsson has placed music at the heart of the phone. A generation built the first digital music library on those small memory sticks. Immediately afterward came the photography revolution. Cybershot. With the K750i and K800i models, with the K750i and K800i models, now you can take you. When you slide down the lens cover at the back with that famous click sound, xenon flash autofocus. At that time, even Nokia's N series didn't feel this cool. Nokia dominated the market, but Sony Ericsson acted as if it owned the market. They were the most popular, most talented, and most mysterious kids in school. Sony Ericsson was at the top. Money was flowing in. Every new model was selling like hotcakes. However, a dangerous virus was spreading on the management level. Arrogance. "We own the Walkman brand. Nobody can beat us," they said. Right in the midst of this surge of self-confidence, in 2007, a man stepped onto the stage in San Francisco. Steve Jobs introducing the iPhone while wearing his famous black sweater. Sony Ericsson executives were probably laughing. They analyzed, it has no keyboard, the battery can't be replaced. Who would buy it? This was the biggest strategic blindness in the history of technology. They were still trying to make a phone. Apple, on the other hand, had put a computer in our pocket. Sony Ericsson was focused on the hardware, the feel of the buttons, and the glossiness of the casing. Apple focused on software, the ecosystem, and the App Store. The iPhone was a device, but inside it lived a whole world. Sony Ericsson was still enchanted by those orange-lit buttons. Panic started when it was proven that the success of the iPhone was not a coincidence. But the ship was so big that turning it around became impossible. The company's biggest problem was a secret civil war, Swedes versus Japanese. The Ericsson side was engineering-focused. The Sony side was design-focused. The design is approved in Japan. The software is being discussed in Sweden. Sony Ericsson was fighting within itself like a two-headed giant. As for software, it was a complete disaster. Symbian and UIQ had become outdated. The touchscreen experience was terrible. There was no such thing as an app store. It was very late to catch the Android train. The Xperia X10 was amazing in terms of hardware. But the software was so sluggish that users wanted to throw the device out the window. They used it by adding heavy and unnecessary interfaces. This was the beginning of the end. By 2010, Sony Ericsson was no longer a leader of its time, but a follower. The company was constantly reporting losses. The design was still elegant, but the spirit inside had drained. Consumers no longer bought phones for the Walkman brand, because now everyone could play MP3s on their phones. Cybershot was no longer an advantage, because every smartphone took good pictures. In 2011, that cold news we had been expecting arrived. Ericsson transferred its shares, saying, "My main business is base stations." This 10-year marriage officially ended for 1.05 billion euros. The name Sony Ericsson is a thing of the past, replaced only by the Sony logo. This wasn't a bankruptcy, but it was more painful. This was the silent death of that green logo that defined a generation's identity. Sony tried to continue on its own, but that cool kid image was gone. The market had now succumbed to the bipolar battle between Samsung and Apple. Today, when we look at Sony Xperia phones, we can still see that design quality. But today, Sony's share in the mobile market is even below 1%. Well, why? Because Sony Ericsson taught us this. Resisting change is accepting extinction. They made the best phone, but the world no longer wanted a phone. It wanted a smart assistant. Like Nokia, they too became victims of their own success. They refused to comply with the rules of the new world in the categories they invented themselves. Imagine, those phones that used to catch everyone's attention when placed on the table now lie in the depths of drawers with swollen batteries and blackened screens. But the memories inside those phones are still alive. First love messages, the first songs listened to with those famous orange headphones, those Cybershot cameras with low resolution but capturing the happiest moments of our lives. The story of Sony Ericsson is one of the biggest lessons in the world of technology. It's not how great you were in the past that matters, but how prepared you are for the future. Technology favors those who run, not those who wait. Sony Ericsson ran for a while, then got tired and stopped. The world, however, kept running. Goodbye, Walkman phone. Goodbye, Cybershot. Thank you for those cool years you gave us. Thank you for watching. You can subscribe and write your thoughts below.